And what drove you to write this book?
Well, after 32 years in journalism, I decided I wanted to change in course, and I went and joined the Pat Finucane Centre. I was lucky enough to get the job, and as I was leaving the building, Paul O'Connor said to me, I've got a project I want you to get involved in, writing a book about collusion. Now, during my entire career in journalism, several people had asked me to write a book on collusion, and I had always refused on the basis that it was impossible to prove. It was a very difficult subject, and quite frankly, I found it repellent, and I didn't want to spend any time looking at something that was so ugly. And so I'd always said no, but I had a new job, and my new project coordinator, I couldn't say no. It was an offer I couldn't refuse. So I knew then and there that I would have to knuckle down and get it done. And as I went through the files and looked at the HET reports that had been produced, I became more and more convinced that there was the potential for a really interesting book in what we'd found. And it was then a question of finding a publisher, and thank goodness Mercia Press came on board. And after that, I just said to myself, get down and do it.
You mentioned that the HET findings were a particularly compelling reason to write that book. Is it fair to say without that work that this wouldn't maybe have been written?
Yes, I think it is fair to say that. The Pat Finucane Centre's staff and volunteers had done everything they could in terms of open sources, that is newspaper libraries, archives, eyewitness statements. They'd done everything they could, and then they were helped when the Barron inquiry was started down in Dublin, and he got access to some of the RUC files in as much as he produced appendices of ballistic and forensic evidence linking perpetrators with different attacks. So we had some facts then, but it really was a step change when the HET became involved. The Pat Finucane Centre decided that with all its flaws and imperfections, there was no other process by which families could get the truth. So they decided to engage critically with the HET, and we were lucky enough to get a small team of very diligent officers of huge integrity and courage who went and looked in the files and reported. And report after report after report came out with evidence of collusion in it, and the families got the reports. And the HET said that they would be producing an overarching thematic summary of what they discovered. But for one reason or another, we think it's possible they came under political pressure not to do so. And we were always going to produce our own report anyhow, because the PFC knew that we'd be able to go further than the HET would, which is a statutory body of former police officers and are pretty limited in what they can say. And we, of course, are a human rights organisation. We can say what we want. So we'd always intended to write a report. But when the HET report never materialised, my work became even more important. So that's how it happened.
You mentioned that you'd focused in on 120 plus murders which happened in a fairly defined geographical area. And am I right in saying that your research led you to believe too that they all had some very common characteristics?
Yes, we think the same gang basically were involved. It's often called the murder triangle, but it was more like a murder polygon than a triangle, because although the epicentre was a triangle between the towns of Armagh, Portadown and Dungannon, there were murders carried out by the same gang that took place in counties Down, Louth, bits of mid-Tyrone, up as far north as Pomeroy, Aughill in County Antrim, and as far south as Dublin. So it was much more than a triangle, but the epicentre was that triangle, yes.
And in terms of, you mentioned that you hadn't really wanted to get involved, that it was repugnant, etc., etc. Did you find yourself even being surprised at how far this collusion went?
Yes, I did, quite frankly. I was surprised at how far the collusion went, and I was also surprised that there was evidence was found, that there was a paper trail. It amazed me what we've managed to find out, for example, in the National Archives. Now, we sometimes, when we go to the National Archives, which we do once a year if we have the funding, and we spend a week in queue going through all the documents, every now and again we find a card inserted in the files saying that the document that it represents has either been destroyed completely or is being withheld for 50 years. And one wonders what is in those documents, because God knows what we do find is damaging enough. For example, just one example of thousands we found was an August 1973 document, which was an internal British Army briefing paper in which the British Army told itself that between 5 and 15% of all UDR soldiers were also loyalists, active loyalist paramilitaries, and that the main source of loyalist weapons was the UDR, and the only source of modern weapons was the UDR. And we found, on top of that, for example, we found month in and month out, the British kept track of all the weapons that had gone missing from UDR bases. And as far back as 1972, the word collusion was being used by the British themselves in their own private documents. So collusion is no modern invention.
You mentioned earlier the Barron Report. What role do you think the Irish government have to play in lifting the lid finally in this very murky world?
Well, bad and all as the British are, the Irish are worse when it comes to releasing documents. Really, the name of our campaign group in Dublin is Justice for the Forgotten, and they have largely been forgotten by the Irish state. The relatives there are, if anything, even further from establishing the truth than relatives in the north. It was, for example, particularly telling that neither the Irish nor the British government thought anything was wrong in inviting Queen Elizabeth to visit Dublin on the anniversary of the Dublin and Monaghan bombings. Now that is adding insult to injury. Just symbolic of that total lack of care.
Have you been surprised at the reaction to your book?
Amazed. I mean, I don't know how many people were here today. It was 500 plus. We're nearly sold out of the first print run, and the publication was only 24 hours ago. We're going to have to order more books from Dublin. I mean, people are hungry for the truth. Not speculation or propaganda or assumption, but for hard facts. People are hungry for that. They want to understand what went on here during the conflict. Because the narrative that we've all got is it was Protestant against Catholic. And I think this is beginning to show people that both parts of the community were being manipulated from outside by authorities and powers in London and Stormont that we didn't know anything about at the time.
Do you get a sense that the dam is eventually and finally about to burst? We have, for example, relatives of the Miami show band taking civil writs. We have families left, right and centre really challenging the narrative that has existed.
Well, I don't know if the dam is going to burst in as much as I don't know if the British government is going to yield up its secrets. It guards those secrets very jealously. Only recently did we find out a bit more about the Mau Mau and how the British treated insurgents in Kenya who were looking for land rights. And that took a long time. And they will resist to the bitter end, I think, because Ireland is so close geographically to Britain, and Ireland was Britain's first colony, and there is a kind of reluctance above anything to tell the truth. I don't know if the dam is going to burst, but you're right. I mean, not only is there the Miami show band families, but we have 24 families, I think now, who are taking cases to the police ombudsman in relation to the murder triangle Glenanne series of killings that we detail in this book. And I'm also afraid, and I say I'm afraid because I know families don't want to go to court, but if families can't get disclosure any other way, they will go to court. There will be years and years of civil litigation in the courts, which will be immensely costly, both for the British state and for the taxpayer and for the families, and costly in terms of human suffering as well, because going to court is a nightmare for people, for families, and there's no guarantee of any outcome at the end of it.
Do you believe that there are other similar gangs, similarly structured, existing in, for example, North Belfast, who operated in a very similar way?
Absolutely. I think it got worse in the 1980s. Far from the British learning from the mistakes that they made in the 1970s with these 120 deaths, and the gang that they eventually closed down because it was getting out of control and that they feared that it was going to be exposed. I think it got more controlled, more manipulative and more directed in the 1980s than it was in the 1970s.
And how far do you think that this collusion actually went up the food chain?
Well, I think it went definitely to the Chief Constable's desk, and I think definitely to the Cabinet. We have a document dated 1975 in which is the minutes of a meeting between the then Prime Minister Harold Wilson, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland Merlin Rees, the newly elected leader of the opposition Margaret Thatcher, and her policy advisor Airey Neave. And during this meeting, Merlin Rees advises all those present that there are elements in the RUC too close to the UVF, and that the UDR cannot be trusted to be loyal. And there are other documents, I'm sure, buried deep in the files. I'm sure it went to the Cabinet table.
And in terms of what you hope this book will actually do to lift the lid finally, I mean, what are your hopes for it?
Well, I hope it will lift the lid, but I also hope that people won't interpret this book as pointing the finger at anybody here, and not any ordinary people here in Northern Ireland. Yes, the Loyalists have to be held responsible for what they did. Every perpetrator is responsible for what they did. And yes, there were corrupt RUC officers and very corrupt UDR soldiers, but there were equally, we're not pointing the finger at an entire community or indeed at the entire RUC or the entire UDR. Indeed, we believe that UDR soldiers and RUC officers died as a result of the conflict being prolonged unnecessarily, because collusion fueled this conflict. It did not resolve it, and many people lost their lives completely unnecessarily. And they weren't just ordinary civilians, they were police officers and UDR soldiers as well. For families who are the victims of collusion, the legacy is an abiding mistrust of the state, for example. Families who believed for 38 years that they were orphaned by a cheese processor who discovered that the cheese processor was actually an RUC man. Families who lost their mother, and another family who lost a young son in the Step-In bombing that could have been prevented by a stroke of a pen or a 30-second phone call, because the RUC knew all about it in advance, and the HE report is unambiguous. This bombing could have been prevented. People who lost their lives, and these quite often, they're all uninvolved. There's no paramilitary or political connections of any of these victims, but quite often they were upwardly aspirational, middle class, well, not middle class, but people who had an education, who were confident, who were hoping for a new future, who maybe had bought a house or were renovating a house, started a new business, owned a farm, owned a business, a shop or a pub. And they were that burgeoning new, confident Catholic middle class in the 1970s who wanted their human and constitutional rights. And it was almost as though this was an attempt to make them, to get them to hang their heads and not to demand their rights. It could have been as calculated as that.